From a disregarded passenger to the owner of an entire airline, an unexpected story that no one on the flight could have predicted. What began? The morning sunlight filtered through the large windows of John F. Kennedy International Airport, casting a warm yellow hue across the waiting area. Amid the bustling crowd heading to their gates, Eleanor Mitchell, an elegant woman in her 70s, stood quietly, patiently waiting for her turn. Her eyes gleamed with anticipation and a hint of nervousness, for this flight held significant meaning. It would be her first time on a plane in many years, and more importantly, it would take her to meet her great-grandchildren, little angels she had O&L. Eleanor wore a tasteful navy blue dress, paired with a black cardigan and her beloved pearl necklace. The wrinkles on her face told the story of a life full of ups and downs, but her eyes still held warmth and resilience. Her silver hair was cleverly hidden beneath a small hat, and in her hands was an old leather handbag, a cherished memory. This trip was a gift from her son, who had repeatedly convinced her to give up the long, tiring bus journeys and enjoy the luxury of first-class seating. "Mom, you deserve the best," he had said. And after much persuasion, Eleanor finally agreed, not only for the comfort but also for the joy of finally holding her great-grandchildren in her arms. However, she had no idea that this flight would not only take her to her family but also become a milestone that would change her life forever, and even the entire American airline industry. "Mom, you deserve the best things in life." Hello there. You're listening to an exciting story on the Soul Deep Stories YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Even more amazing, I have a special message for you. If you leave a comment sharing the name of your country and your current time zone, that means fate has brought us together every day. Now let's dive in and enjoy this fascinating story together. Eleanor Mitchell hesitated when her son booked her a first-class ticket for this flight. She wasn't used to luxury, she had always been accustomed to simplicity and practicality. But after many attempts, her son finally convinced her, not only for the comfort but also for the excitement of meeting her great-grandchildren for the first time. As she walked into the boarding area at Los Angeles International Airport, surrounded by passengers dressed in upscale attire, the scent of expensive perfumes mixed with the lively sounds of departing flights. A few glances were cast toward her, evaluating, scrutinizing, as if her presence in first class was out of place. But Eleanor was no stranger to such looks. She had lived through a time when discrimination was the norm, not just an attitude. So she held her head high, clutching her ticket tightly. C2A. Approaching the check-in counter, Eleanor smiled warmly as she handed over her ticket. The flight attendant checked it, paused for a moment, then forced a polite but awkward smile. "I hope you have a pleasant flight," she said, but her tone was so cold that Eleanor couldn't ignore it. Eleanor walked down the aisle, feeling the excitement rise as she took in the luxurious interior of the first-class cabin. The spacious seats, soft lighting and glossy details made it feel like this flight was a world apart from her memories of travel. After a lifetime of putting others first, this was the rare moment she allowed herself to indulge in a little luxury. But before she could sit down, a cold voice interrupted her peaceful moment. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Eleanor turned around. A tall woman with blonde hair, dressed in a crisp uniform, stood with her arms crossed in front of her chest. The name Karen Holloway gleamed on her name tag. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Karen asked, her gaze sweeping over Eleanor as if searching for a mistake. Eleanor was no stranger to that kind of look. Calmly, she held up her ticket. "Yes, 2A." Karen glanced at the ticket, her lips pressed tightly together. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but you'll need to arrange your belongings quickly to avoid slowing down the boarding process." Eleanor nodded and reached up to place her small handbag in the overhead compartment. However, her aged hands weren't as swift as they once were. In an instant, Karen folded her arms, sighing in frustration. "Do you need help?" Her voice was reluctant. Before Eleanor could respond, a young man from the seat beside her stood up, gently taking the bag from her hands. "Let me help, ma'am," he said with a sincere smile, effortlessly placing the bag in the compartment. "Thank you so much." Eleanor smiled in return, while Karen narrowed her eyes in annoyance. "All right, please don't block the aisle," Karen said sharply before turning on her heel, leaving a tense atmosphere behind. Eleanor sat down, her hands clasped in her lap. The curious gazes around her lingered. Some were inquisitive, others indifferent, but a few were clearly uncomfortable with her presence. She took a deep breath, focusing on the goal of this trip, her great-grandchildren, their innocent smiles, their little arms embracing her. But the tension didn't end there. A few minutes later, when fastening her seatbelt, Eleanor noticed it seemed to be stuck. Not wanting to break any safety regulations, she gently pressed the call button for the flight attendant. The sound of high heels striking the floor echoed with annoyance. "What do you need now?" Karen's voice was cold, her irritation clearly evident. Eleanor still kept her gentle smile. "I think my seatbelt is stuck. Could you help me, please?" Karen exhaled sharply, bending down to pull the seatbelt with little effort. "There's nothing wrong, you just need to pull harder." Eleanor nodded, speaking softly, "Thank you, you're very kind." But Karen didn't bother responding. She turned away muttering, "Making demands already, this flight is going to be long." The passengers around them began to notice. Not only did they see Karen's lack of patience, but they also felt the palpable contempt in her tone. A few minutes later, Eleanor realized she had forgotten to take her medication before the flight. She hesitated briefly, but health was more important than anything. She pressed the call button again. Karen turned around, this time crossing her arms, her eyes icy. "What is it now?" Eleanor remained calm. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need some water to take my medication." Karen curled her lips into a sneer, dramatically sighing. "We haven't taken off yet. Water service won't start until we reach cruising altitude. You'll have to wait. I just need a small sip to take my medicine." Eleanor's voice remained gentle, but with a slight pleading tone. Karen rolled her eyes. "Fine." When she returned, she placed the plastic cup of water down sharply on Eleanor's tray, without saying a word. The passengers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some began whispering to each other. A young woman seated nearby leaned in and whispered, "Don't mind her. She's been treating everyone like this since we boarded." Eleanor smiled gratefully. "Thank you, dear." But deep down, she understood that Karen wasn't just a grumpy flight attendant. She was doing this on purpose. Eleanor had lived her whole life facing attitudes like these, judgments based on appearance, the subtle disdain because she didn't belong in these luxurious spaces. But what Karen didn't know was that Eleanor wasn't someone who could be easily defeated. Eleanor Mitchell looked out the airplane window, trying to let her mind wander to the vast scene outside. The fluffy white clouds drifted lazily under the sunlight, the sky stretching wide like an opening to a peaceful world. She reminded herself of the purpose of this trip, the little arms of her great-grandchildren reaching out to embrace her, their innocent laughter echoing in the air, the memories she was about to create with her family. But no matter how beautiful the sky was, it couldn't conceal the tense atmosphere brewing in the cabin. Up ahead, Karen Holloway, the lead flight attendant, was pushing the drink cart down the aisle. With every other passenger, she flashed a professional smile, her tone light and her words smooth, "Thank you for flying with us," coming out effortlessly like a line rehearsed thousands of times. But when she reached Eleanor's seat, her attitude immediately shifted. Eleanor cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, may I have a small cup of water?" Karen stopped, her eyes narrowing with irritation. "Water?" Her voice carried a hint of mockery, as if the request was completely unreasonable. "Yes, just a little." Eleanor maintained her gentle tone, but her voice was firm. Karen placed her hands on her hips, her face as cold as stone. "Ma'am, this is not a charity organization," she said, her voice raised enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. The cabin fell silent for a moment. Surprised glances turned toward Eleanor. She felt her face flush, but not out of embarrassment, rather from the sting of unwarranted humiliation. She had been through such situations before. She recognized discrimination whenever it appeared in any form. A middle-aged man sitting directly behind her shook his head, muttering, "This is unacceptable." Eleanor looked up at Karen, her eyes still warm but tinged with deep sadness. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you," she said gently. "I just need to keep hydrated for health reasons." Karen didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to a colleague nearby and sneered, "Seems like we're running a water charity on this plane." The comment, although laced with sarcasm, did not draw any laughter. Before Eleanor could speak, a small voice rose from across the aisle. "You can have my water, ma'am." Eleanor turned to see a young girl, about 9 years old, her big, bright eyes full of sincerity, offering a small bottle of water. "You don't have to, please take it," the little girl said, her voice gentle but resolute. Eleanor's heart ached with emotion. She smiled warmly, taking the bottle from the child's hands. "Thank you, little angel. You're so kind." The child's parents nodded toward Eleanor, their eyes filled with empathy. Meanwhile, Karen's face went pale. She realized that her cruelty had not only failed to diminish Eleanor, but it had also garnered support from those around her. She clenched her hand around the drink cart handle, then snapped, Keep the aisle clear." With that, she hurried off, not saying another word. Eleanor slowly unscrewed the cap of the bottle and took a small sip. The cool water soothed her throat, but what truly comforted her was the small yet meaningful act of kindness from the little girl. The girl's mother leaned over the aisle and softly asked, "Are you all right, ma'am?" Eleanor nodded, her smile faint but resolute. "I'm fine. And thank you for raising such a kind-hearted child." The mother squeezed her daughter's hand, her gaze filled with pride. Karen, though walking away, still radiated discomfort. The more Eleanor received support from those around her, the more Karen grew irritated. Her movements became more abrupt, her voice harsher, and her glare toward Eleanor more resentful. But Eleanor refused to be shaken. She looked out the window once again, letting her mind drift to the little arms that would soon greet her as the plane descended. She had faced injustice many times in her life, and she knew that patience and kindness were the true ways to win. What Karen didn't realize was that her anger was being watched by dozens of pairs of eyes. Some passengers had pulled out their phones, recording everything. They didn't know who Eleanor was, but they knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just a rude flight attendant. This was discrimination. And what was happening was clear evidence of that. Karen had no idea that, in this moment, she was unknowingly starting a storm she could never have imagined. That storm would change not only Eleanor's fate but the airline itself, forever. "She hasn't done anything wrong." A furious voice came from the row behind. A middle-aged man shook his head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," another passenger whispered, full of indignation. Up front, a young woman in business attire pulled out her phone, beginning to film the scene. Her face was serious, her eyes determined. She knew she was witnessing raw injustice, and she wasn't going to let it be buried in silence. But Karen Holloway didn't care. With a smug smile, she turned toward two security officers who had just boarded the plane, pointing directly at Eleanor Mitchell. "She's the one," Karen said, her voice firm as if she had just rid the plane of a nuisance. Eleanor's heart tightened, but she gave no outward sign of emotion. With the calm composure she had honed throughout her life, she gently picked up her small handbag. The two officers approached, their voices soft but resolute. "Ma'am, we need you to follow us." Eleanor nodded, her chin still held high. "Of course." Her voice was gentle but unwavering. Before leaving her seat, she looked around at the passengers, offering a small apologetic smile. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience," she said, though in her heart she knew she had done nothing wrong. As she walked down the aisle, a wave of protest erupted. "This isn't right," a man shouted. "She didn't do anything," a woman cried out angrily. On the other side of the aisle, the little girl who had offered Eleanor the water tugged at her mother's hand, her wide eyes filled with confusion. "Mom, why are they taking her away? She's so nice." The mother leaned down, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Sometimes people are treated unfairly, dear. But I promise you this won't be forgotten." Eleanor walked on, slow but steady, full of courage. Though she was being escorted off the plane amid Karen's smug satisfaction, she would not allow anyone to strip her of her dignity. Karen stood at the front of the cabin, arms crossed, watching the scene with a haughty smile. This was her victory. At least, that's what Karen thought. What she didn't realize was that dozens of phones had recorded everything. The outraged passengers, they had seen enough to know that this wasn't just bad service. This was prejudice. As Eleanor stepped off the plane, the security officers escorted her to a deserted waiting area. One of them, sensing the injustice, said softly, "Madam, we are just following regulations. If you wish to file a complaint, we are ready to assist." Eleanor nodded slightly. "Thank you, gentlemen." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes flashed with determination. On the other side, Karen had already begun preparing for takeoff, unaware that a storm was brewing. The remaining passengers already had plans. Videos began to be shared. Messages of complaint flew into the airline's inbox. A wave of outrage gradually formed, a wave that would engulf Karen before she even realized what she had caused. Karen's nightmare was beginning. In a quiet corner of the terminal, Eleanor opened her small purse and took out her phone. She hesitated for a moment. In her entire life, she had never relied on her son's reputation. Even though he was a powerful man, she had always prided herself on her humility, never asking for special favors. But this time was different. She pressed a familiar number. After 2 rings, a deep, powerful voice sounded. "Mom? What's wrong? Aren't you supposed to be on the plane right now?" Eleanor closed her eyes slightly, took a deep breath before answering. "No, son. I was just kicked off the flight." A moment of silence stretched out. Then the voice on the other end changed, becoming cold, sharp as a razor. What? Why? Eleanor replied slowly. Because that flight attendant, she didn't like the way I looked. She said I was being disruptive. I didn't argue, I just left. On the other end, a deep, angry breath. Which flight attendant? Her name is Karen Holloway. Again, silence descended. But this time, it was the calm before the real storm. Mom, I'll take care of this immediately. Where are you? Gate 12. Sit there, don't go anywhere. This isn't just about you. This is a much bigger issue. Eleanor nodded, responding softly. I know. That's why I called you. In the airline's operations room, all hell broke loose. Telephones rang in the tense atmosphere. Linda Carter, the head of operations, answered. Hello, Mr. Jennings. Linda, I just received some terrible news. The sharp voice of Michael Jennings, the airline CEO, boomed. My mother, Eleanor Mitchell, was just kicked off one of our flights by a flight attendant. A deadly second of silence. Linda's face went white. Yes, and I want to know exactly who ordered this, what happened, and why it wasn't reported immediately. Linda frantically searched for the data on her computer. The flight attendant in charge of that flight is Karen Holloway, sir. Michael Jennings narrowed his eyes. Good. I want all security camera footage, all passenger complaints, and her personnel file on my desk within 15 minutes. And when that plane lands, I want Karen detained immediately. I will speak with her personally. Linda swallowed hard, typing furiously on the keyboard. Karen had no idea what awaited her. But in just a few minutes, her life would change forever. My children will never have to hear words like that. They will have opportunities one never had. I will do everything to make sure that happens. Eleanor Mitchell had sworn that oath on that fateful day when she was just a 9-year-old girl, standing in a grocery store with her father, her small hands clutching the saved coins to buy a notebook for school. But that small dream had been extinguished when the shop owner coldly snatched the notebook from her hands and said in a contemptuous voice, We don't sell to your kind. Eleanor's father, a quiet but resilient man, said not a word. He simply squeezed his daughter's hand and turned away. But even without shedding a tear, Eleanor saw the pain in her father's eyes, a pain she vowed never to let her family's future generations experience. From that day on, she worked tirelessly. She worked 2, even 3 jobs at once, sometimes going without food to save every penny for her children. She taught them that a person's worth was not in how others saw them, but in their own effort and integrity. Her son, Michael Mitchell, was an intelligent and ambitious boy. One day when he was only 8 years old, he ran home, excitedly holding up a notebook full of airplane drawings. Mom, I'm going to build airplanes someday. Eleanor smiled, ruffling her son's hair. Then you have to work hard, son. Dreams are free, but success has a price. And Michael worked harder than anyone. He excelled in school, earning scholarships that took him to places his mother had only heard about on the radio. He studied aerospace engineering, then business, and gradually climbed to the highest positions in the aviation industry. Eventually, he became the CEO of one of the largest airlines in the United States. But Michael never forgot his mother. Every time he was honored, he always said, I am here today because of my mother. She is the reason I have all of this. However, Eleanor's journey was not easy. Her husband, Henry, passed away when Michael was just a teenager. She had to work twice as hard to raise her son, sometimes cleaning 3 houses in a day to earn money, but never letting her son see the fatigue or despair in her eyes. She didn't have time to break down. Instead, she filled her small house with laughter, with stories of hope, with evenings reading to her son about the great people who had changed the world. The past never truly sleeps. Sitting in the VIP lounge that her son had arranged for her, Eleanor sipped a cup of tea, letting her mind drift quietly to the past. She had spent her life not letting bitterness corrode her heart. Even when treated unfairly, she always believed that dignity came not from how others treated you, but from how you faced life. But today, when Karen Holloway smirked and called security to escort her off the plane, she felt like she was back to being that 9-year-old girl standing in the grocery store, rejected, belittled, deemed unworthy. She put down her teacup and straightened her back. No. She had fought to overcome these prejudices her entire life. Today would not be the day she bowed her head. The phone in her purse vibrated. Eleanor took it out, looking at the familiar name on the screen. She took a deep breath and pressed the answer button. Mom? Michael's voice came, full of concern. Aren't you supposed to be on the plane? Eleanor closed her eyes, keeping her voice calm. No, son. I was just kicked off your flight. A deadly silence. Then she heard a slow, heavy breath, the sign of rising anger. What did you say? That flight attendant, she didn't like the way I looked. She said I was being disruptive. I didn't argue, I just got off. This time, the silence was even more frightening. What's her name? Michael's voice was so low and cold that it sent shivers down her spine. Karen Holloway. Mom, stay there. Don't go anywhere. This isn't just about you anymore. Eleanor smiled slightly. I know. That's why I called you. At the airline's headquarters, a storm was brewing. The phone rang, signaling the impending earthquake. Linda Carter, the CEO, answered. Hello, Mr. Mitchell. Linda, I've just received an urgent news, Michael said, his voice as tense as a wire. My mother, Eleanor Mitchell, has just been kicked off a flight on our own airline. A second of silence so complete that Linda could hear her own heart racing. Sir, what did you say? I want the name of the head flight attendant right now. Linda frantically searched the system. The head flight attendant on that flight is Karen Holloway, sir. Michael narrowed his eyes. Good. I want every security camera footage, all passenger complaints, and her personnel file on my desk in 15 minutes. And when that flight lands, I want Karen detained immediately. I will speak to her personally. Linda dropped her pen on the table. Karen had no idea what awaited her. But in just a few minutes, her life would change forever. She held her head high and didn't let anyone bring her down. She's a true inspiration. The video recording of the incident quickly went viral, racking up millions of views in just a few hours. Comments poured in from all over the world. How could they treat such a wonderful woman like that? This is the problem with society today. People are judged solely on their appearance. Ms. Hazel is a queen. I hope she's okay. News agencies quickly caught on to the story. In newspapers and on television, shocking headlines appeared. Police car light airline CEO's mother humiliated in shocking incident. Fire, holding dignity amidst fire. Elderly woman shames world with discriminating flight attendant. Meanwhile, Eleanor Mitchell was still sitting in the VIP lounge, completely unaware of the media storm raging outside. And Michael Mitchell, her son and CEO of the airline, was being bombarded with calls from reporters and activists. Some demanded accountability, others praised his decisive action against Karen. But most importantly, Eleanor's story had become a rallying cry for justice. Passenger rights advocacy groups hailed her as a symbol of quiet strength and perseverance. But Eleanor remained humble. She did not ask for this attention. She just wanted to see her great-grandchildren. As Michael entered the VIP lounge, he found his mother sitting calmly knitting, as if the world outside was of no consequence. Michael, she smiled gently as she saw her son approach. You don't have to do all this. Michael sat down beside her, his eyes full of determination. No, I have to, he said. What happened to you is wrong. And it's my responsibility to make sure it never happens to anyone else. Eleanor sighed, her gaze as gentle as it had always been. Son, you always had a big heart, she said. But remember this, we cannot control how others treat us. We can only control how we react. Those words made Michael pause. You reacted to all this with more dignity than I think I could have, he admitted. But this time it's not just about you. We have to make sure no one else has to go through this. Eleanor nodded slowly. She had been thinking a lot on the flight. She wasn't the type to let things slide and expect others to fix the world. All her life, she had fought for equality, for respect, for dignity. And she had no intention of stopping now. Michael, she said, her voice firm, this isn't just about me. It's about all the people who have ever been treated like me, as if they aren't worthy. Michael nodded, his eyes thoughtful. I know. I've heard the stories. I've seen the news. This isn't just one flight attendant. This is a bigger problem. Eleanor looked straight into her son's eyes. Exactly. And words aren't enough. Action is what matters, right? Michael was surprised by his mother's decisiveness. What are you thinking? Eleanor didn't blink as she replied. I want to lead the change, Michael. I don't want to just stand by and watch. I want a part in this airline. A real part. Michael's eyes widened in astonishment. You mean? I want you to transfer a large portion of the airline shares to me, Eleanor said. If I want to change things, I need a real voice in this company. Michael sat stunned for a few seconds, unable to believe what he had just heard. His mother, who had never asked for anything for herself her entire life, was now demanding something powerful. But this wasn't a selfish request. This was a movement. And no one could lead it better than Eleanor Mitchell. Michael took a deep breath, his eyes gleaming with pride. If this is what you really want, I'll do it. Michael immediately carried out the necessary procedures to transfer a significant portion of the airline's shares to his mother. Loudspeaker, the official announcement was made. Police Carlight, Ms. Eleanor Mitchell, a passenger rights activist and a symbol of perseverance, will now serve as a major shareholder in the airline. She will lead initiatives on equality, employee training and policy changes to ensure that every passenger is treated with respect. Globe showing Europe-Africa. Eleanor's story became a worldwide phenomenon. Other airlines began to review their training processes. Large corporations reached out to her to learn about diversity and inclusion. And passengers? They felt more protected than ever. Chart increasing. The airline stock, after falling due to the scandal, quickly recovered and even skyrocketed. Speech balloon. One customer commented, "Not many CEOs dare to stand up against their own employees to protect what is right. But he did. And his mother, Eleanor Mitchell, is a true hero. She never imagined that just one small act of hers would destroy her entire career." Crossmark fired immediately. Crossmark banned from the aviation industry. Crossmark boycotted by the public. Karen Holloway once thought she had power on that plane. But in the end, true power belonged to those who dared to stand up for justice.